Hello and welcome. I'm Cassidy Cash, and this is episode 155 of That Shakespeare Life. This week is part 2 of our 2-part series on John Harington, the inventor of the first flush toilet in England. Our guest, Bob Cromwell, is back again this week to take us into 16th century England and explore the exciting life of John Harington. We go beyond his invention of the flush toilet to take a look at his role as a literary figure. John Harington was a member of the royal court under Elizabeth I and would go on to tutor the son of James I, Prince Henry, and he's famous primarily for his translation of Orlando Furioso, which was kind of a joke punishment by Elizabeth for John Harington. Bob's here to tell us about that story as well. And Harrington's destiny in terms of serving in the royal court was put into motion by his father, also named John Harington, who ended up in prison in the Tower of London at the same time Elizabeth I was placed there by her sister Mary. Bob is here this week to share with us some of the historical research that indicates Shakespeare may have even included references to John Harington in his plays. Bob Cromwell is the author of the article The History of the Flush Toilet and lead historian at toiletguru.com. Bob's work has led him to document plumbing in 24 countries through the Neolithic era to spacecraft and several writers and artists in addition to Shakespeare. Bob holds a PhD and has worked as a consultant for the Folger Shakespeare Library. Find more on Bob in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Bob.
Okay. Hello.
Nice to have you back with us again. Thank you for being here.
Oh, sure. Thanks for having me back.
As we dive into the life of John Harington here, his father actually ended up in the Tower of London with Elizabeth I of all people. What did he do to end up in prison with a future queen?
Yes, it gets confusing. Which John Harington? And, we were sending email back and forth in between these two episodes. There were so many men whose name was John Harington. And then the one that you're talking about, the father of the inventor, translator, etc., he actually ended up in prison a couple of times. And they both had to do with, he wasn't even directly suspected of being involved in a conspiracy, but some people who were suspected of starting some conspiracy against Mary knew him, mentioned him in a letter, something along those lines. And so he had married this woman who, Ethelreda, she was an illegitimate daughter of King Henry VIII. And Henry had gotten his tailor to claim to be her father. And so he had given this tailor a whole bunch of property, which were various monastic properties that Henry had seized, with the understanding that, it's really for her. And so the guy who was fronting as her father died. She inherited this property, and John Harington, the father, had married her. And this must have been rather awkward because earlier he had been put in the Tower for getting mentioned in a letter. And the lieutenant, the man who ran the Tower of London, ended up being his father-in-law eventually. And so John was married to this illegitimate daughter of Henry VIII. They'd been married maybe a year, and one of her co-workers, one of her co-ladies in waiting, so they were ladies in waiting to the Princess Elizabeth, her co-worker really caught John's eye, and he started writing sonnets to her. Later, he got put back into the Tower, again, got mentioned in a letter. I think that one actually, his not crime, but what he was suspected of, what he was blamed for, he delivered a letter to Elizabeth. Didn't even know what was in it.
Ooh.
He got put in. So there he was in the Tower of London, and somewhere in another section of the Tower, there was the Princess Elizabeth. And she was locked up in the Tower, but she was the princess, and so she got to bring along 6 of her ladies in waiting. one of whom was his wife. Another one was the one he really was sweet on, who would eventually become his wife. And he was back in the tower where he had previously been locked up by the man who would eventually be his father-in-law. Confused yet?
So all interconnected in like 8 different ways.
Yes, yes. And in that time, you could get yourself out of prison in some ways. You could ask for favors from the right people. Um, he got himself out. Elizabeth wasn't in there terribly long. I think she was actually in the tower for maybe like 3 months, but their time did overlap. And she got released into house arrest. And sometime after that, he got himself explained, excused, released from the tower. And then Elizabeth was allowed to move from, pretty strict house arrest to kind of back to the way things had been. And she was living in a palace. So John started visiting all the time. Um, of course, to pay tribute to the princess and so on, but the lady he really liked was in there. And we know this because we have sonnets that he wrote. And so his son, the inventor, was very, very enthusiastic um, collector of information about himself, about his family, anything for self promotion, anything to help to attract patrons.
When did John Harington Jr., the son and man who invented the flush toilet, become Elizabeth I's godson? Is there any association between his father's tributes to the princess and eventually becoming his son becoming Elizabeth's godson?
Well, yeah, sure, because he was always showing up. And that must have been really awkward because, one of the ladies in waiting was still his wife. This was maybe about 6 months later. Elizabeth took the throne. So Queen Mary died. Elizabeth, became Queen Elizabeth, I think, in November. And then a couple of months after that was the official coronation. And Harrington's first wife died later that same month, maybe just a couple of weeks afterwards. And maybe a month or two after that, they didn't wait terribly long, they were married. And of course, Queen Elizabeth knew both of them very well. I mean, the mother had been, still was her lady in waiting originally, and the title changed somewhat. But she became, one of the ladies of the Privy Chamber. And then her husband was also a member of the court. So they were, kind of almost like half family in there in a way. Um, Also, the father had been, and tough to keep track of, but he had been married to someone who was the, whatever you call it, illegitimate half sister of Elizabeth. So they were kind of sort of family. And so, yeah, so she just immediately said, oh, yes, I'll be his godmother. And now, there was 101 other godchildren, but she did particularly like him.
In the whole kingdom, though, that's a huge number of godchildren, but not in terms of how many people there were in the populace. It was still a very elite group, I think, to
Yes,
be a member of, which
yes,
is
definitely,
impressive.
definitely.
And his father had no idea he was building this relationship for his son when he was locked in prison, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, he was just smitten with this woman he was writing sonnets about.
One of the translations the literary John Harington is remembered for today is his masterful work on Orlando Furioso. Bob, what were the circumstances that led to Harington, the inventor, being assigned the translation of this difficult work?
Yes, assigned translating the rest of it, I guess is the way it really goes. So he had gone to Eton and then he'd gone to University at Cambridge and had started to study law. His father died and he went home to take over the estate in Kelston and to finish building it. But I mean, he was well educated and quite a bit of skill at both Italian and Latin. And so he was in the court. He had grown up as a member of Queen Elizabeth's court. She had accepted him as a godchild, basically when he was born. And his parents had been a member of her court all along. And so he was there. So Orlando Furioso, it's this Italian epic poem, something like 38,000 lines. It's one of the longest epic poems in European literature. And it was from Italy, very different culture than in England, and at least the people in England saw, oh, those Italians, they write some pretty racy stuff, some pretty risque parts. So Harrington found some of the particularly risque part and translated that. And it wasn't like he was coming in and saying, "Oh, listen now as I read this erotica to you," but he just kind of gave it to some of Elizabeth's ladies in waiting and said, "Oh, you might enjoy this. You might find this kind of fun." And they were passing it around and yeah, being embarrassed and outraged and giggling, and then, "Oh, let me have it back and read it again." Elizabeth eventually found out about this, and apparently it's not that she was really offended herself, but felt that she sort of needed to be or needed to appear to be. And so she said, "Okay, what's going on here? What is it? What have you done? What is this thing? Go away. Don't come back until you've translated the whole thing." Now, maybe she literally meant to get rid of him, but based on things that happened later, I don't think so. And it was kind of, okay, go away, let everybody cool off and kind of forget about this, and then, come back and we'll kind of start over. Well, he was gone for quite a while. He described it as well over a year, maybe 2 or 3 years. What happened to that guy that used to be around here? And all at once he shows up. He not only has the whole thing translated, but he has got this thing bound in this beautiful printing. And so it's one of the things that people looked at him and said, well, that's really kind of flaky. People who are very academic, they would just come back and say, yes, I've done it. Here's a manuscript. Maybe I will turn this over to a printer that I trust. He got super involved with how this thing was going to be packaged, how it was going to be printed, what the covers were going to be like, what the illustrations were going to be, down at a level of detail that hardly anybody got involved in. But part of this was, well, that was just the way he was. Part of it was, he said, this is really going to be useful to me. I'm going to be able to maybe get some patrons with this. So, of course, it's going to be dedicated to Queen Elizabeth, but a lot of other wealthy and powerful people are going to get copies. And it ended up being a success, and it got reprinted, I believe, until the early 1960s. And of course, there would be additional commentary, additional references that somebody would add on to this. But up around like 1962 or 1963, there was a publication then of somebody's edition of Harington's translation with their added references.
Impressive.
Yeah, yeah, and 1590s to 1960s. That's quite a lifetime for a
That's
book.
that's a long lifetime for a book, sure. So it paid off his effort into making sure it was worth it on his that 2 3 years seems like nothing now, I'm sure.
A good investment, yes.
In Shakespeare's Love Labour's Lost and Troilus and Cressida, we see a pun on the phrase a jakes, which is a reference to the Metamorphosis of Ajax that Harington wrote in 1596, just a few years before these plays were written. We know that Shakespeare references current events in his plays quite frequently, with puns like this one being just one way we can see 16th century culture jumping off the stage within Shakespeare's works. Bob, does Shakespeare write other references to John Harington and his translation of Orlando Furioso that we can find in his plays?
That's a really good question. And it turns out, and this is something that I've learned, it's been a steep learning curve for me since the last time we talked. Something I learned just in the last couple of weeks. There's a theory, and there's arguments out there. I'm sure there's various people have written their thesis on this, but in As You Like It, there's a couple of characters in there. And think back about Harrington. What did people know about him at that time? Well, the first big thing he did was Orlando Furioso. And Orlando is the Italian name. In French, therefore in English, Roland, one of Charlemagne's warriors, is who this is about. But Orlando Furioso was, the name of the work. And he was also, actually, people were calling him Sir Ajax Harington for his writing about his toilet design. Anyway, at that point, people said, well, we thought it was weird enough that he got all involved with the book production and book binding and design and all that. That was odd. And then he goes and writes a whole book about toilets. Well, this guy's pretty odd, pretty unusual, but kind of gets your attention. If you look at Shakespeare's play as you like it, two major characters in there are Orlando, who is the admirable young hero, and then there's Jacques, who's this cynical fellow. And that's sort of the theory is, well, that's kind of the two major aspects of John Harington. Is Orlando related to the very admirable academic work he did, and Jack, Ajax, at the time they would have all been pronounced the same. The particularly oddball, flaky, cynical character, Shakespeare may have meant for those two to be the two faces of John Harington.
There's certainly a case to be made there for that, I think. Harington was a master at translations, obviously, and remembered in posterity for tackling works like Orlando Furioso. However, despite his work as predominantly this literary figure, Elizabeth I calls Harington to participate in a military expedition in 1599. Bob, this seems like an odd selection by Elizabeth, given Harington's general lack of military experience. Why was Harington selected for this job?
I think because of his nature, but yeah, he got this letter from the Earl of Essex, shows up out of the blue. He's reading this letter, and at the end of it, there's this long sort of, oh, by the way, postscript added to this. And Essex says, oh, yeah, by the way, Elizabeth is sending me off as the leader of this military force, 16,000 troops, sending me off to Ireland. It was the biggest army that England had ever sent anywhere. And the Tudors had been attempting to rule Ireland, and it hadn't been going well. And they were 7 or 8 years into a 9-year rebellion at that point. And so Elizabeth had said, okay, you're going to be in command of this army. You're going to go off, and here's what I want you to do is, look, you're a force of 16,000 troops going up against a bunch of rebels. You ought to be able to just pretty much show over and take charge of the place right away. This O'Neill fellow who's running the rebellion, I want you to go straight to him, confront him, take over, and send word back, and you stay there and keep things under control. And oh, by the way, take my godson along. And so Harrington reads all this. He gets the end of this, and Essex is telling him, yeah, and we're leaving pretty much right away, so get your stuff. And Harrington wrote to somebody describing this, saying, I scarce had time to put on my boots. And off he goes on this military expedition. So this was 1599. So this was about 4 years before Elizabeth died. After a pretty long reign. And so a lot of the people she had relied on as confidential advisors were no longer available to her. And so she thought about her godson and said, well, okay, this guy, he's a keen observer. He carefully observes things. He does a good job of describing, of writing up what he saw. And I think a really big part of this was he just simply didn't care what people thought about what he wrote. He would write whatever he thought was appropriate. And that's what she wanted. She didn't want somebody who was going to be there thinking, oh, now let's see, what would Elizabeth really hope that I said or really hope that I noticed? He's just going to tell it like it is. And it was not a good expedition. It didn't go well for England. Essex was sent to confront O'Neill, who was known to be up in the far north. So what did he do? He took his army all the way south and got involved in some kind of pointless battles. Eventually goes up, finds O'Neill, and at this point, O'Neill has this treaty for him to sign, for Essex to sign on behalf of England to a truce. I mean, it was basically a surrender. And so Essex does this. Now, he hadn't accomplished much militarily, um, although Elizabeth had told him to do certain things that he didn't. Now, Elizabeth had told him not to be giving out a lot of orders, because Essex was kind of notorious for giving out awards. And she said, you need to be like me, because I mean, she hardly gave out. If you got an award from Elizabeth, it was a really big deal. Well, Essex had been issuing knighthoods left and right, and so he could do that because they were on this overseas military expedition. It was kind of like a battlefield commission, I suppose. And so about all he had accomplished was create a whole bunch of knights. So all at one morning early, to Elizabeth's great and unpleasant surprise, she wasn't even gowned or wigged, they say. Um, Essex shows up in her bedroom out of the blue, and she is thinking, what on earth are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Ireland. He starts explaining what had happened. Oh, she was just hopping mad. And she said, if I'd wanted to abandon Ireland, I didn't have to send you all that way to do it. I could have just simply abandoned the place. And I'm pretty sure Essex knew this was not going to go well, so he had brought Harington along with him, sort of as his backup or his
I'm sure
wingman.
Harington is thrilled.
Oh, I'm sure. Yes. And
Why?
she's,
Why?
yeah. Why did you drag me into this? Well, as sort of as a lightning rod. And Elizabeth is carrying on, and she's like, well, did you issue any knighthoods? And, then he can point at Harington and say, oh, yeah, this guy, I made him a knight. And what? You weren't supposed to do that. Harington could say, well, yeah, but it wasn't just me. There were hundreds of them. And so by the time they got back, over half of the knighthoods in England had actually been issued by Essex. And Elizabeth was just hopping mad. And she, basically kick them out, get out of here. I got to get dressed. Essex, tomorrow you come back and you're going before the Privy Council. He got interrogated by the Privy Council for about 5 hours straight. And they said, you disobeyed orders, leaving Ireland when you were supposed to stay there, dereliction of duty. He went into house arrest for about a year. He got released from house arrest, but he was still pretty restricted in what he was allowed to do. And within 6 months, he was leading a mob of people. He out of his, one of his several mansions. He had one on the Strand in London, and he led this mob out of his mansion, and they were marching to go demand to see the Queen. Well, he got arrested, and within a week or two, he became the last person to be beheaded in the Tower of London. Of course, all that was in the future, but Harington's thinking, oh gosh, how bad is this going to be for me? This is going to be the worst I've ever been into trouble. I've never seen her this angry.
It had to have been his position as her godson that prevented Harington from being
Sent to the tower.
Yes, because he's right there. And I mean, a letter just mentioning his father is what landed his father in the Tower of London. And then here's Harington standing there going, why did you drag me into this? Gosh, I can't imagine. But he does seem to survive this whole affair in a royal position, or at least part of the court, because after Elizabeth dies in 1603, he goes on to work in the household of James I. He's tutoring James's son Henry. So how did he make this leap from associated with this rebel that gets beheaded to now he's tutoring the king's son?
For the next ruler. Yeah. Well, so there she was, angry, no wig, in her pajamas, whatever, yelling at these two guys, and just sends them out, and has told Essex to come back for his interrogation. She sent for Harrington, and she let him kind of stew on it for maybe 3 or 4 days. But then she sent for him, and they spent, the better part of the day together. And I think that's really when he delivered his detailed report. And she she had sent him to do exactly what he did. He actually did an excellent job of what she wanted him to do. Um, she'd been really super angry when the two of them had appeared with no warning early that morning. Um, but he had just sort of been dragged into that. And so she actually was not all that angry with him. She did tell him to go home, but it was more really resignation. She was saying, there's no point in your hanging around here and making jokes and trying to cheer up my court, because I think my court is sort of beyond cheering up at this point. So you might as well go home. So he did, but he kept in touch. He kept sending things and things to cheer her up. And he gets referred to as the Queen's saucy godson. That's actually how he signed some things. That he would send her something, and it would be, at the end of it, signed Your Highness's saucy godson. So he did what he could to keep cheering her up. But yeah, before too long, he saw, okay, it's going to be the end of her reign. And of course, you don't talk about the death of the ruler before the ruler dies. But he was very anxious to make that transition. And so he put together some things. He wrote some things, but he didn't. He acted more as an editor in this because it'd be a whole lot safer. And so he kind of saw the three big factions at the time as the Papists, the Protestants, and the Puritans. And so he edited together this book on other people's opinions, which is a lot safer, other people's opinions of why James VI of Scotland should become James I of England and why it should transition from the Tudors to the Stuarts, um, with arguments from the three major factions. And of course, he made sure that James got a copy. And he started just, in advance, sending some things to James. At one point, he sent a lantern. He had this lantern custom made. Well, and it featured the penitent thief being crucified alongside Christ, saying, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." Get it? Get it?
I see. Clever. Nice.
And made sure to send that to James, and notice the quote that's on here. And so yeah, he got in touch with James in advance.
So after he got in touch with him, how does he become the tutor though? He gets brought into the royal household. What happens to make him, so he's made his presence known, but does James remember him then when he becomes king and bring him into the palace, or was there some kind of application process that he went through? How did that happen exactly?
Yeah, the presence, and he made his presence known and his utility known. And so there was yet another episode of someone getting mentioned in a letter. James Harington the younger got mentioned. He not only got mentioned, but he was related. So there was Elizabeth died in the spring, I think in April, and maybe the funeral was in May, something like that. Um, James came down from Edinburgh to London, and it took a month to come down there. And he stopped along the way. Now, the last time we talked, you asked me about Harrington's invention, his wash down toilet. And he had one at his home that he had built, because it turns out he was really interested in water in general. And so when he inherited the property, he added a bunch of fountains that he had designed and had built. So he was into different sort of water related things. So it was not a huge leap, I suppose, to write about this toilet that he invented. and he had given one to Queen Elizabeth. And it turns out there was another one of these. So Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury, also received one of these things. And Robert Cecil ended up being the Secretary of State under Elizabeth and continuing under John, I believe. And I don't know if King James knew him in advance, but he stopped at Robert Cecil's place on the way to London. And so it was up in May sometime by the time that James arrived in London. So from May to June to July, just a couple of months later, there were already two plots that got discovered, conspiracies against James. And one of Harrington's cousins had some connection to the people in these, and they were both pretty implausible, really. One of them was some coalition of Roman Catholics and Puritans were going to band together and kidnap the king to demand that he be nicer to them and their co-religionists. Like that would work. There was a parallel plot to basically to replace James with a cousin. And they weren't very likely to happen, but they were plots. And so this Markham fellow was arrested, convicted, sentenced to death. I believe taken to the point that they marched him out up onto a platform, put his head on the block, made sure the axe was sharp, and then they said, "Oh, by the way, if you'll pay this £4,000 fine and then go into exile, we won't kill you," which sounded like a pretty good deal at the moment. So he went along with that. Well, he didn't have the £4,000. So he just fled into exile and said, well, that's it. I'm never going back. Harington was his cousin. And so Harington got put into prison in London, not in the Tower. I think it was the Gatehouse prison. And he was in there for, I think, 10 or 11 months. And he got released. Harington asked his pal, Robert Cecil, that he had this good connection to in the past about what can you do to get me out of here. And then part of it was an argument. Uh, James had actually created Harington a knight of Bath uh, very soon after taking the throne in recognition for Harington's service to the throne in general in the past. And so here was this guy, he'd made him a knight. And then, oh yeah, kind of forgot about this, but he had seized Markham's property and given them to Harington. And, this came up and said, oh, yeah, that's right. We did seize all of Markham's property, so it's not like he has anything to sell to pay that fine anyway. And we've had Harington in prison for a while, so we'll let him out. And at that point, Harington mostly stayed home. So he was from this place called Kelston, this little village outside of Bath. And so he ended up not really being actively the tutor of Prince Henry, but he was definitely involved in his education. James wasn't really interested in being much of a father figure. James saw his role as a schoolmaster for his children. And so he would direct education. Harington said, well, there's a spot for me. I can produce the material and I can write these things up, make sure that they're, appropriately admiring of the realm. And that's going to be my livelihood, is producing these books.
Well, I think we see Harrington definitely try to use this skill in his position to help Prince Henry, because when James's son Henry falls ill with typhoid fever, Harrington does a translation work to try and help Prince Henry. Bob, what was the work that Harrington translated, and did it actually help the prince?
I doubt that it was much help. He translated from Latin a large collection of medical guidance. So sort of a home health care / medical text that was quite outdated by the time that he did that. But again, it was a masterful translation, and so historically of great interest. Medically, not so much, but he stayed connected. Harrington stayed connected to the court of James. And the most recent thing I found, and this to me, this is just the most amazing bit of Harrington's writing, was Harrington was mostly staying at home in Kelston. It didn't go to London very often, but at one point there was a big party at Robert Cecil's place. And so King James had married a princess of Denmark. So King Christian V of Denmark was King James's brother-in-law. And so King Christian of Denmark comes to England for a state visit, and he's there for a month or so. And for a while, they're staying at Cecil's estate. And there was just the most epic party there. And Harrington was just so energetic about documenting his own life, documenting himself, because, it helped in getting the patrons. And it was just the way that he was. He liked being, in the court. He liked being at the center of power. He liked the environment and all that. Um, and the things he saw. And so in a book that's a collection of a whole bunch of miscellaneous papers, including a lot of letters. And so, apparently when he would write a letter to somebody, he would make a copy and keep it so he could bind all this together and do the self-promotion. So during this month of debauchery at Cecil's estate, they had this grand masque one day, and there was going to be this play depicting King Solomon welcoming the Queen of Sheba. And both King Christian and King James were just notoriously heavy drinkers, and their courtiers had trouble even trying to keep up with them. And this was one of these cases. So by the time they start this masque, the players, they can't remember their lines. Some of them can't stand upright anymore. It just descends into chaos. And so it's depicting a meeting of rulers with grand feasting. So it's like there was this meeting of rulers with this grand feast going on, and they're watching, they're sort of embedded in this play about this sort of thing. And so this woman comes carrying this enormous tray of food, trips, dumps all the food on King Christian, and then just falls headfirst into his lap. And so he's just covered in smashed food. He says, "Oh, that's okay. Let's dance." Jumps up to dance with her, just collapses in a heap.
Oh, wow.
So they say, "Okay, brief time out here. We need to take a brief break while we carry him off and lay him in a bed in the other room. He's just covered in smashed food, but just take him over there and let him sleep it off." Okay, restart the play. Out come these three figures, the embodiment of faith, hope, and charity. These three women come out. Faith tries to speak. She has some lines, but she can't get them out. And either she's forgotten them or she's just rendered herself unable to speak at this point. And so she just sort of staggers off. There goes Faith. Hope doesn't even really try. She just goes over and joins Faith. That leaves Charity. What's she going to do? Well, she kind of hunkers down at King James's feet, and she's kind of mumbling incoherently. Nobody can tell what she's trying to say. She either staggers or crawls off to join Faith and Hope, who Harington tells us are spewing vomit off to the side. Later on comes this figure of peace. So here she is. She's the embodiment of peace, and she's trying to make a beeline for King James. She keeps bumping into people. They keep getting in her way, or she gets into their way. Who knows? Everybody was so drunk, it was hard to tell what was going on. But she's got her olive branch, and so she just starts savagely beating people over the head with the olive branch of peace to get them out of her way so she can get to the king. And if Mel Brooks had included an Elizabethan segment in History of the World
He
Part
should have
One,
turned this into a movie. It's just
it,
waiting to be made into a Monty Python episode.
yes, 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 and actually, yeah, yeah, Mel Brooks might be actually too tasteful. It might be more of a Monty Python thing.
Oh, wow, that's incredible. I'm so glad that, I mean, it seems so self promoting for Harrington to have written all of that down, but I'm so glad he did. How would we have known that peace walks through the royal court feeding people with an olive branch?
Yeah, yeah, and that's it. I mean, we know more about Harrington than we do about most writers of that period because he was so self-promoting. And I mean, I think he was kind of like the Andy Warhol of the Elizabethan era, of someone who did some things, who did some art, but maybe his greatest creation was himself and his self promotion. And he did it in a way that it didn't annoy people. They didn't hate him for it. It seemed pretty harmless, and it could certainly be entertaining, and it certainly worked.
Well, Harrington did eventually reach the end of his life. What did he die from and when?
Yeah, I'm not sure what he died of. He was, I believe, he was 52.
Same age as
So,
Shakespeare.
oh, really? Okay. And, in that age, somebody gets to 52, that might not be too bad in that time. And there was a lot of, endemic diseases, cholera, typhoid that Prince Henry died of. Um, Sanitation needed to be fixed.
So there were a
And
lot of things that could have taken him out, and
yeah,
we
we
don't know
don't
for
know.
sure.
We don't
Well,
know.
where is he buried? Is his grave something that we can visit today?
It actually is, yeah. So Kelston is a small village outside of Bath, about 4 miles outside the city of Bath. That's where he was born, where he lived when he wasn't at court in London or wherever the ruler was at the time. But yeah, Kelston was his home, and so it was purchased and then demolished in the mid 1700s. The same as with Robert Cecil's estate. It was just they were of a different style, and they were purchased by people with a lot of money and very different taste. And they said, this is the old Elizabethan style. So the manor, the plumbing, there's nothing to see, but his grave is there in Kelston.
I know we would love to explore the life of John Harrington further, especially to be able to know where to go to read some of his letters and explore these stories that he wrote for us. What are some of your favorite books or resources you can recommend we use when we want to go and learn more about John Harrington?
Um, the one I'd most recommend, and I know I'm going to mangle the pronunciation on this, but Nugi Antique, which I don't know Latin. It looks kind of like ancient nuggets. It's a collection of writings by the father and the son, and it's very very miscellaneous. The family kept the promotion alive, and so it got assembled in, I think it was 1804, and so that's available. And all of these are things that either Google Books and or archive.org, you can see them. You can read the scans of the originals that are in different places. Harrington's edited volume of Why James Should Be the Next King is available. Um, Also, Orlando Furioso. The originals out there. The thing with that is, with Project Gutenberg, they started making available things from the 1800s when people were a lot more squeamish. So there's an Italian version of it. If you want the ones that don't have the dirty parts cut out, you're going to need one of the either Harrington's original translation, or you're going to need something more recent.
We will link to all of these as well as to Bob's work and research into John Harington on the show notes for today's episode. So make sure you go there to find those. Now, Bob, as you know, we ask everyone this question here at That Shakespeare Life, and you will get to choose a second desert island book for your visit here with us. But what is the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Okay. I knew this one was coming because we did this a couple of weeks ago. And so then I said The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. Now something totally different. It occurred to me The Code Breakers by David Kahn, which it's a history of cryptography, which is something I'm professionally interested in. It has a lot of history of that period of Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, and Mary, Queen of Scots, who of those has, I think, the most famous or most notorious connection to historical cryptography and how it could go horribly wrong when you don't know who you're exchanging your supposedly secret messages with. Plus, it's an enormous book, so if I'm going to be stuck on the island, that would give me plenty to read.
Well, I think that would be a very good choice for sure. And so what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I want to learn some more about that period, some of the intrigue. I particularly interested about Elizabeth and her spies and Walsingham and his roles in this.
Those sound like exciting areas of research for sure. Bob Cromwell, thank you so much for being here with us again this week to share with us part 2 of John Harington and getting to know him and his life. This has been a fun conversation, and I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me back.
As always, we pack bonus history into the show notes of every episode we do here at That Shakespeare Life, and that includes the one today. You can find images, links to books, and more information on our guests' research, all packed into the show notes for today. So find all of that at CassidyCash.com/episode 155. That's CassidyCash.com/EP155. That's it for this week. Thank you for being here. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.